Kern, and I'm the director of the Adnana Center for India Studies here at Cal State Long Beach, and I'm also the director and chair of the secondary teacher education program here on campus. I want to welcome everybody to our talk tonight by Dwaipayan Banerjee. And before introducing our speaker, I do want to recognize members of the Solanki family. If they're not joined us yet, they will be joining us later for their generosity that has made events like this possible. I also want to thank Dr. Mihir Pandya, who's the assistant director of the center, and he's for all his efforts in organizing this event. And Vashalay Chowdhury, who's our student assistant, who's sort of driving the Zoom car behind the scenes. And that's much needed and very much recognized. I'm also glad to see that we've got a large audience tonight. And we've got a few folks here that have joined us from our Solanki World History Teaching Fellows Project. So I'm really looking forward to this talk. I really think it's going to be super interesting. So let me introduce our speaker. Dwaipayan Banerjee joined us tonight from MIT in Cambridge, Massachusetts, where he's the assistant professor in the Department of Science, Technology, and Society. Dwai grew up in Delhi, did his MPhil and MA in sociology at the Delhi School of Economics, and then did his PhD in cultural anthropology at NYU. Dwai's research aims to push science and technological studies into the global south, and I think all his work, and I think tonight we'll see this a little bit as well, always seeks to challenge narratives that have focused on Western agency in these areas. He's already published 2 important books in what is a young career. His first book, Enduring Cancer, Life, Death, and Diagnosis in Delhi, was published by Duke University Press in 2020. And Hematologies, The Political Life of Blood in India, fantastic title, published by Cornell in 2019. Dwai's also a scholar of many talents. I noticed Dwai, that Dwai's done a film, The Beloved Witness, on the Kashmiri poet Aghaz Shahid Ali, was nominated for the Best Short Documentary at the New York Indo-American Film Festival. So very impressive. So tonight's talk, entitled Planning and Dreaming, Art and Aesthetics in Post-War Bombay, comes from his current book project that investigates the early history of computing in post-colonial India. So please let me welcome Professor Banerjee. And one last thing before you take over the show here, Dwai, could I ask everybody to put their questions in the chat, right? And then we'll take questions, or Dwai will take questions from the chat at the end of his talk. And yeah, please mute yourselves as well. So Dwai, the quote unquote Zoom floor is yours.
Thank you, Tim, for that really kind introduction. And thank you, Mihir, also for the invitation. I'm really looking forward to presenting at the center, and it's looking forward to a conversation after the talk is over. So I'll spend a little bit of time setting up what is the main part of the talk, because it kind of follows the journey that took me into this project. And you can already perhaps sense there's a movement between thinking about the early history of computing, which is the broader question that I work with, and what I'm talking about today, which is art and aesthetics in post-war Bombay. So what is that connection? And I think it might be helpful to kind of walk you through that connection as it unfolded in my own research. So what began this project was looking at a few instances of really early post-independence development, post-independence innovation in computing technologies. And in a way, a sort of innovative direction that really isn't the picture that we have now, which is so much to do with software and so much to do with outsourced labor, as we all know. This moment was really interesting to me because it seemed completely the opposite. And in that it was solely and very consciously focused on developing indigenous hardware. So it's the early leaders of science, technology, and personal independence India were very keen on not falling into this divide between hardware and software, but to actually create Indian computers right from the first, from the moment that computing was instituted as in the United States. So this slide that you're looking at now is basically inauguration of what might be the first Indian computer. Some argument about which one is exactly the first, but this is potentially the first one that actually worked. There were several other attempts that just didn't. So this one is the computer that you're looking at is called the TIFRAC. And I'm bringing that up because the acronym TIFR is the institution that I'm going to focus on. TIFR stands for the Tata Institute for Fundamental Research. And what became really
I
clear—
only know the kids in your class from kindergarten. So I know Eric, the small Eric. Right? Wait, that's Eric?
Sorry about that.
No worries. So the Tata Institute for Fundamental Research seemed to be the place that had developed basically the first computer in beginning in the early 1950s. And what was really fascinating was that it was very much on par with von Neumann's work going on in Princeton at the same time. There was no sort of time lag, and there was no sort of gap in the way in which this early work was being done. And that idea of a time lag and how important it's become is something I'll try and focus on in the talk. The other side of my fieldwork is Calcutta, which was developing alongside TIFR their first version, and it was a really kind of exciting race in the early 50s between ISI, the Indian Statistical Institute in Calcutta, and Tata Institute for Fundamental Research in Bombay. Both were going head to head and trying to basically beat each other to kind of have the first working model. Arguably, I'd say TIFR won, and so I'm more or less going to be focusing on the history that unfolds at TIFR. But I'm not exactly going to be talking about computing directly, and that's because as soon as I began this project, some kinds of frameworks began to both become clear as well as felt quite limiting. And what I mean by that is any sort of work in thinking about science and technology in India, and if it's focused in the 50s especially, has to deal with this legacy of what is now known as the Nehruvian science model. What does that mean? So Jawaharlal Nehru, India's first prime minister, famously invested in thinking about science and technology as a way to modernize India, to leapfrog into the contemporary world, undoing the harms and faults of colonial rule. He's kind of synonymous with the 50s, and his kind of emphasis on science and technology as central to state planning is synonymous with how the state is conceptualized often in this early moment in post-colonial India. Now, why I find this idea of thinking about Nehruvian science a little limiting is because it's overdetermined in two ways. Now, it's been basically critiqued from every angle possible. And in the early, I'd say from the 70s to the early 2000s, the critique came very much from the left. And what the left kind of insisted on, and this is a set of really influential books, both within India and from outside, and this is just, it's not representative, but sort of gives you a sense of what that critique could be. This critique from the left was that Nehru, being part of a kind of ruling elite, had tried to basically plan the state from the top down. And so a quote that is attributed to him, that he thought of dams as the temples of modern India, kind of captures his emphasis on big tech, on thinking of large-scale technologies as solving the problems of underdevelopment. And many in the Indian left, many scholars such as Ashish Nandi, Shiv Vishwanathan, Claude Alvarez, were not completely on board with this idea and thought that it actually had created a sort of divide between the elite and the rest of the country. They critiqued this kind of model of thinking about science and technology as leading to development for basically buying into quote unquote Western scientific values. And what these values that what they found to be extremely problematic was was encapsulated for them in the explosion of the atom bomb. They thought that Western science at that moment, as they conceptualized it, had basically reached its most violent kind of peak. And so years of basically scientific development had culminated in their mind in the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombing on the one hand, and in the Nazi scientific project on the other. So they were really concerned about India importing the ideas of Western science directly, not being attentive to the harms and violence that can produce within a new nation state. They were really concerned, for example, of thinking about the new citizen as just someone or something that you experimented on. And so the kind of metaphor they used was the citizen as this experimental subject and science as a kind of vivisectionary mandate, as they called it. And so, for example, they were really critical of the displacements of large groups of people by dam projects that basically for the benefit of the larger nation state projects sacrifice the working class, the poor, and those that were already vulnerable. So this is something that is kind of a long-standing critique in the Indian left of Nehruvian science. What's interesting the last 2 decades is to see how it's shifted in a way and has come, and the critiques now coming very much from the current sort of lean towards right-wing politics. And Nehru has come under attack, and the Nehruvian science model has come under attack in a similar but a kind of different way, which is that, again, it too blindly imported quote unquote Western values. But if the left was saying that what was lost here was a kind of secular tradition, also a kind of commitment to working class and labor politics, for the right, it was not exactly that vision of India that was being lost, but it was a failure to acknowledge Indian developments in quote unquote Hindu science before the colonial rulers had kind of taken over the scientific kind of steering wheel. And it kind of attributed, this critique attributed to this Nehruvian science model the problems of economic underdevelopment that continues to plague India in the present. So of course, this is coming from 2 very different directions. But what's interesting to me in thinking about this kind of critique, both from the left and right, is while they disagree on the on the content, what they sort of share in their critique is a separation, what they find to be a separation of facts and values. So what they find, what the left found was that the science became this sort of completely value neutral enterprise, whereas they understood science as always embedded in moral in morality and socio-political concerns. But this kind of imagination, Nehruvian imagination of science as something neutral, took away its distracted for the left. It's the need for science to also be involved in things like anti-poverty programs and also alongside land distribution efforts. So this idea that science could be taken outside society and be thought of as a sort of top-down value neutral tool was really problematic for the Indian left. For the Indian right, there's a different set of values that they thought was being lost. And that set of values was thinking of science as cultural, as part of a Hindu tradition. And the dissatisfaction existed in the 50s, but has become much more pronounced in the last 2 decades. This idea of Nehruvian science being a Western science model that basically sidelined and marginalized Hindu visions, Indian visions of what science and technology could be. So completely different critiques, but what comes to my mind is that they both share this idea that science has to have moral value. It has to have a social content. And that in some way, the Nehruvian vision of science had lost that eye on moral and social, ethical kind of, had lost its ethical commitments, basically. So why am I bringing all this up? This is all to basically say that to imagine to do any work in the 50s and 60s, be it on computing, be it on any kind of scientific work, has to sort of reckon with this big overdetermining way in which that moment is considered. And this is the most kind of, skipping ahead a little bit, the characterization of this moment is so dominated by this one singular vision of science that is so committed to this top-down westernization, top-down modernization, I think loses a sense of what was historically actually going on at the time. And I think what was going on was much more interesting and much more complicated in ways that we haven't accounted for, in a way that the concept and idea of Nehruvian science completely misses. And one way to think about it is, and what I'm going to do in this talk is to think about it in the institute where the first computer was developed, the Tata Institute for Fundamental Research, and the pioneer of that institute, the founder of that institute, Homi Janvi Bhabha. Now, to situate, I'm doing this really, I'm situating my talk around these two figures and this figure very consciously, because Bhabha and TIFR are really thought to be the best example of what Nehruvian science was. Bhabha and Nehru were famously very close. A lot of the early funding of the Indian nations, early funding for science and technology in the 1950s went directly to Bhabha's institute, much to kind of the dismay of other scientists like C.V. Raman and others, and Meghnad Saha at the time, who also had institutes of their own, but Bhabha's influence over Nehru and the Indian nation state was larger than life. And so in a way, I want to see what might be gained from thinking about the contradictions and various other impulses that animated science at the time from really the center of what is thought to be Nehruvian science. So I want to really kind of not come at it from the margins, but to see what's going on in the very heart of the Nehruvian science project, whether this characterization, both from the left and the right of it, holds true. And one can see that characterization if you just go to the Wikipedia page, as a sort of big picture sense of how Bhabha's legacy is understood in the present. The Wikipedia page will tell you he's colloquially known as the father of the Indian nuclear program, that he was basically part of his legacy is what culminated in the Indian nuclear bomb. And here all the kind of contradictions and paradoxes start becoming clear. If we take this characterization of Bhabha as correct, then of course the entire critique of the left makes so much sense. They were really critical of the Indian state for ending up with their own version of the bomb. If they had thought that the kind of violence of the Western science model had resulted in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, they were completely unsurprised that the Nehruvian model led to the atom bomb, to the India's own nuclear tests later in the 90s. So if that characterization is correct, then Homi Bhabha should give us a kind of picture of that kind of big state Western science model. And if this characterization is correct, the critique from the right should also hold, which is that he, being the elite westernized figure that he was, trained in Cambridge, part of a very particular Parsi class in Bombay, basically was completely out of touch with quote unquote India and Indian traditions. And so for the right, Bhabha is also a perfect target and target for attack because of his own because of his very overt sort of westernized upbringing and his own kind of persona. But I want to complicate this picture and basically try and see if there's something else possibly going on. The Tata Institute for Fundamental Research is located in the outskirts of Bombay, and that's where I'll begin my story. It was founded by Bhabha, and it is basically sited on the sea, and it's not accidental that it's so close to the sea. It's part of this whole vision of Indian science as in the Nehruvian era as being shielded from the rest of society, having this sort of privileged, closed off space where the scientist in Bhabha's imagination could wander the sea and think big ideas and plan big dreams. So that's where I began my research. I started looking at the archives there, trying to find out what was going on with the early history of computing. But as soon as I started doing that research, it became clear that focusing so directly on just computing and just this kind of picture of Nehruvian science would not really lead me down the path that would give me a good sense of what was going on in the 1950s in the world of scientific technology. And one of the reasons why that became extremely clear was that as soon as you walk into the foyer of the building, you see a massive 13-foot mural. You can see it on the top of this image. And this mural is painted by M.F. Hussain, who is potentially India's most famous artist. And so something's going on here. It became clear to me that something was going on here because Hussain was not the only one that was represented in the walls of this laboratory. Basically, every important Indian modern artist was represented alongside Hussain along the walls of the cafeterias of the basically just sort of casually hanging in spaces along the labs and the canteens and the photocopy machines, etc. So what was going on? And so looking a little bit more deeply, I saw basically that this lab turned out to be perhaps perhaps is holding the best collection of Indian modern art anywhere in the world, including any museum. And so something kind of started clicking in my mind that this idea of science is this value neutral, completely universal, outside society model. Something was going on here where aesthetics and art was so fundamental to thinking about TIFR that thinking of it as value neutral didn't quite make sense. And that's what I tried to do in the talk, try to look at aesthetics as a way of figuring out what really were the values built into thinking about science in this institute. So let's think a little bit of Homi Bhabha himself. And this is a self-portrait of Bhabha at 17. And this gives you a sense of kind of aesthetic vision at the institute that he was part of. Bhabha was trained in Cambridge and was famously interested in actually creating art and was a fairly prolific painter by his own terms. This is a early kind of his earliest perhaps public foray into art. He won several prizes for this in Bombay and then went on to make different kinds of art throughout his career. But I'm bringing this picture up, this painting up, not because I'm kind of trying to say that he's a fantastic painter, arguably he wasn't, but to kind of point to the style that was influential at the time. And the painting that you see, his own brother described as a boyish attempt to paint in the style of Rembrandt. And if the critique that Bhabha was just a kind of imported Western model is real, this would be the best evidence for that. It's not very innovative. It's basically taking up a kind of Western style and painting in that idiom. And it's not accidental that he was doing this. His art teacher was somebody called Jehangir Lalkala. And Jehangir Lalkala was trained by people like John Kipling, Rudyard Kipling's father, a coterie of British artists who were basically sent to India to teach Indians to paint in a Western idiom. And so Lalkala was part of that British training to help understand Indian artists, how to paint in paint basically in a realist style, impressionist, realist, but not Indian style. And I'll come and I'll really kind of unpack that as we go through the talk. But what I want to just say about this image is that this is exactly the kind of painting that Bhabha spent his career turning away from. He was, when later on Lalkala would ask to be exhibited at TFR, when he'd ask Bhabha to come and visit his own work, and Bhabha broke off all contact and really spent his entire career trying to create a different vision and different aesthetics at TFR. And that's what's sort of interesting to me. So what I'm basically interested in is not really talking about Bhabha as an artist himself, but to see what he did to the art world in Bombay and the kind of art that he made possible. And to see that one magazine that still is published in India becomes really important. And that magazine is basically MARG, the Modern Architecture and Research groups. The acronym stands for the Modern Architecture and Research Group. And this was a journal or magazine basically that very consciously was trying to create for India a new vision of architecture, a new vision of aesthetics, and a new vision of planning all together. So that's where I get the title of my talk from, Planning and Dreaming. This is the first issue of MARG, the first page of that first issue, where people like Mulkraj Anand and Bhabha were trying to put together a vision of what new Indian, of what aesthetics in this new India should look like. And this magazine only came into existence because of Bhabha's influence. So Mulkraj Anand had spent the war in and much of his much of the 30s in England, where Bhabha and him had become friends. And when he came back to Bombay, Bhabha took him to the Tatas and created basically the funding structure and the financial possibilities for MARG to emerge as a magazine. And what was the ethos behind MARG? And the ethos is, very simply put, a kind of idea of universal humanism. And for both Bhabha and for Mulkraj Anand, what they were insistent on trying to create was this idea that the idea of humanism that the West had developed was not exactly, was not wrong, but it had been misused and misappropriated in the West by its own contradictions. It had not lived up to its own standards of bringing universal rights, universal freedoms. Colonialism was the prime example of how the West basically had failed itself. But for Bhabha and Anand, this was not a failure of liberal humanism itself. It was a failure of the way in which it had played out in a particular historical context. What they thought was that the post-colony was the place for humanism to actually really flourish for the first time. And so MARG was basically their salvo into intellectual history, into aesthetics, into science, into technology, saying that for the first time in the world, we will really bring about what the humanist vision is. A humanist vision, let's say, being about the equality of all human beings, of this kind of commitment to commitment to a sort of universal human community. They thought that through MARG, through their own efforts, they could for the first time do what the West had failed to do. And the Indian world would be, Indian art and science and architectural worlds would be where this vision would unfold. How would they do it? And this is where a group of German war emigres becomes really important. I won't dwell on this at all, really. But the first painting that was acquired at the TIFR says a little bit about the importance of German war emigres in Bombay at the time. What Bhabha did very consciously again was to bring two critics and artists who had who'd fled Nazi persecution in Germany and turned up in Bombay, Walter Langhammer and Rudy von Leyden. He, So the image that you see is a portrait of Rudy von Leyden by Walter Langhammer, and I again won't go into details. But what they really did was become Bhabha's mouthpiece in the art criticism world, writing not only in Mark but basically taking over the Times of India's art section in the 1950s. So Langhammer became the the director of the newspaper's art section, and von Leyden became the newspaper's main art critic voice. And so this was again very much part of Bhabha's big picture planning for the city that had very much to do with art and also to do with science. But what I'm interested in is how he was actually really setting up the art world in a particular way. On the one hand, he set up Marg, where the criticism would be published, and the other, he set up the actual critics who would publish in that magazine. But all that is just prelude to the art that I'm interested in actually tracking that became the focus of TIFR's collection, and the kind of the art that basically characterizes the aesthetics of the laboratory even today. And that art goes by the label of the Progressive Artist Group. And that's some of the artists that I will now go into are basically just about coming into their own at the time at the same moment as India becomes independent. M.F. Hussain on the one hand and F.N. Souza on the other. And this picture sort of captures this group in all its in its earliest moment. It's a picture in 1947 Bombay, and what you see here is basically all six. Well, what you see here is basically the artists that till today are perhaps the six most well-known artists that India has produced in its post-independence history. And you see them all at a moment where they have absolutely no recognition. They're all living hand to mouth. And I'll go into each one of their, well, I'll go into some of them in detail, but from left to right, you see Syed Hussain Raza, F.N. Souza, Guy Tonde, Tayyib Mehta, M.F. Hussain, all captured together. So something about this moment was really interesting to me. How did these people basically come together? What was the role of Bombay in making this collection of people possible? And again, the answer turned out to be Bhabha and Marg and the kind of patronage they produced. It's hard to kind of remember that these were all artists who came from absolutely no means. They all turned up in the city pretty much with nothing but their brushes and the bag on their back, and with absolutely potentially no kind of access to the elite Bombay art world, which was dominated by people like Lal Kala and British trained artists. These were basically a group of ragtag misfits with no sort of patronage networks. Raza, pictured here, had moved to Bombay just a few years before the painting was taken, the photograph was taken. He was living hand to mouth in the room of a taxi driver who worked at night. His own first exhibition in 1943, he wasn't invited for because he wasn't elite enough. And the thing that really catapults him to fame is Rudy von Leyden and Bhabha making a concerted effort to make his paintings, to basically create a critical vocabulary around his paintings. Why do I find this interesting? So as a very short kind of anecdote, Raza went to Kashmir in 1947, and as an Indian Muslim, he was basically caught up in the middle of India's partition, and he basically turned up in one of the most kind of conflict-ridden moments and times of Indian partition in order to paint landscapes. And this struck me as sort of odd. Around him, basically, the world was burning down. Gandhi had just been assassinated. His own parents had both died the same year. His own loyalties to India were being questioned as a Muslim. And he seemed completely unconcerned by all of this. But still looking back at the time, he thought of this year as actually completely transforming his own aesthetic practice, even though he had nothing to say about the politics. And what really kind of was catalyzing for him was meeting Katya Bresson in Kashmir that year, who looked at his painting, one such as these, and said that he had no sense of overall construction or form, and told him to basically study Cezanne and to create a different kind of aesthetic vision for himself. And this remark just stayed with Raza throughout his life, and his paintings just take a very different form, starting from 1948, where he becomes really obsessed with just form and construction. This is K.H. Ara, who again had no sort of access to elite art worlds. He was Dalit. He was working basically as a domestic laborer. And again, this was basically the Vaudemetres and Bhabha getting together and creating a critical discourse and vocabulary around him. For example, you see Von Leyden writing about RNK in the Times of India, really playing up this idea of this artistic genius who had no money, who had no means, but only this kind of poetic and artistic intuition. And this was the kind of artists and aesthetics that Bhabha and people like Von Leyden were trying to cultivate, this idea of an outsider, who basically was born out of their own kind of intuition and impulse. This had no kind of commitment to tradition and to the nation state project and so on. F.N. Souza is a much more famous, famous kind of artist around the same time, again, brought into being by the critical vocabulary that Bhabha and Von Leyden were creating. He started off as very much as a poster child of the Indian left. He was creating these kinds of very stark depictions of poverty and famine in 1946 and 1947. But by the time that the picture gets taken, he himself has a breaks up with the left and starts creating a different kind of vision. And that's the vision that I want to kind of come to, that becomes encapsulated in this group of people. The vision basically gets encapsulated in Souza's manifesto for the group, and the title for the group, which is the Progressive Artists Group. What were the progressive artists interested in? They were basically interested in one single idea, which was a complete and uncompromising commitment to abstract formalism. This is a quotation by Hussain later on, who acknowledged that there was a lot going on in India. He acknowledged independence had just happened, that there was this whole ferment, there was partition, but what was really important for him to say was that none of that entered into their artistic world. What they were committed to was abstract formalism and nothing but abstract formalism. And so this was kind of my first sort of clues to what was going on at the time. Hussain and the other artists continued to talk about this idea of significant form as what was animating their entire project. What they meant by significant form was artistic theory that had sort of grown in Britain in the early 20th century, which was, and in the words of the critic Clive Bell, which was basically what I just said, this sort of commitment to thinking purely through formalistic terms, through formalist terms, moving away from realism or kind of traditional idioms of painting. What was not lost on them was that the British thought that this was exactly what Indian artists were not capable of ever producing. So Clive Bell's close friend, the art critic Roger Fry at the time, had basically suggested that all Indian works were completely incapable of modernism. Indian artists were part of this kind of Oriental myth, past, and their kind of vision was so driven to the kind of excessive and kind of excessive commitment to mythology and to over representation, that nothing in India could basically never produce modernism. That was the kind of thing that they were trying to contest. So this, I'm going to move forward a little bit and point to a little bit of a nuance that's going on here. And that nuance is that a group of other artists at the time, other creatives at this time, the Progressive Writers Group, have been much more widely written about, people like Faiz Ahmad Faiz and Mulk Raj Anand. And while their kind of names look the same, their visions of art could not be more different. And this is kind of interesting because Mulk Raj Anand inaugurates the first exhibition of the Progressive Artists Group in Bombay, and immediately says that the idea of progressiveness means that artists, and whether they are writers or painters, should commit themselves to social realism, to kind of creating a realist vision of what India was at the time. What the progressive, and he says in the opening of that exhibition, that the artist should care more for the subject of the paintings and the paintings themselves, that they're conscious of the environment, that their art is publicly available. The progressive artists said exactly the opposite. Led by Sousa, they said that what they were committed to was a break from context. They wanted to create a kind of art that did not condemn them to only representing the realism that was in their time, that did not constrain them to the environment, quote unquote, that they were in, and that did not make them beholden to the audience that was imagined to be the Indian audience of post-independence India. So what were they doing here? And that's where some of the stakes of what was going on becomes important to point to. For Indian artists in 1950s in India, there were basically two choices. Either you follow the academic realism that the British had decided to institute in the art schools and in the art training programs, most famously in the JJ School of Art, that dominated the aesthetic landscape of both, not just Bombay, but the rest of the country. The choice was either to accede to this British characterization of taking up realism in the form of the painting that you saw in the beginning, in the Lal Kala style, or to create visions of India, which was more quote unquote national. And this was another impulse that was very strong at the time. And everyone in Bombay, apart from the Times of India, every newspaper, every art critic was insisting that they do this, that they create an Indian nationalist art driven by kind of a Nehruvian vision, where they would create a kind of realist aesthetic that would match the kind of vision of Nehru to modernize India. So art and modernization should go hand in hand, was this idea of a kind of world of 1950s art criticism in Bombay. And so the critics of the time completely panned the progressive artists, saying that their kind of turn to formalism was a betrayal of basically the Indian project of modernization. They did not understand what India needed at the time was a vision of realism and a vision of kind of post-colonial modernization that would take them through the stages of history that eventually would lead them to a kind of post-colonial, from underdevelopment to development. And so realism would be the kind of march would be the aesthetic vocabulary of that march from underdevelopment to development. So on the one side, there was this group of nationalists in the Nehruvian mold who were saying that the duty of the artist was to paint and commit themselves to aesthetic realism. On the other was a group of emergent right-wing critics, amongst them K.M. Munshi, who basically did what is often, which has become only too familiar in India, basically used the police and other forms of censorship to raid the work of the progressive artists, because from this point of view, the only point of Indian art in this emergent right-wing vision was to create mythic depictions of Hindu glory. So clearly the progressive artists had no commitment to this either. And they painted in quite graphic forms. And so on the one hand, they were attacked by the secular Nehruvian critic who said that they must paint in a realist vision and contribute to India's development through science and technology. On the other side, they were attacked by the Hindu right, who were saying they should paint in a kind of Hindu nationalist world. And so why do I find this interesting? And I'm going to start wrapping up now. I find this interesting because it sort of paints a really interesting picture of what was going on in that historical moment. And what was going on was that in the 1940s, the Indian left had its best aesthetic decade. What do I mean by that? When World War II broke out, the Congress took an anti-war stance, and for that they were severely repressed by the British. The Communist Party took a different stance. They took a stance of kind of an internationalist, pro-war in the sense that they wanted India to ally with the Russian effort. And so the Communist Party went from being a sort of underground enterprise to a legitimate enterprise allowed by the British to flourish in the 40s. And so what was really significant as an aesthetic movement in 1940s was the Indian People's Theatre Association, which was basically, in a nutshell, the Mulk Rajanand vision, which was theatre for the people, by the people, thousands and thousands of theatre groups across the country producing a kind of communist vision of Indian art and aesthetics. What is interesting to me about the progressive artist group is that you have another vision of a sort of kind of liberated Indian aesthetic awakening, which is not committed to the left, which is not committed to this idea of a communist social realism, where they commit themselves to abstraction as a kind of form and distance themselves to any kind of overt political project. And this is very much Sousa's career, where he goes from painting pictures that are titled the proletariat and the plutocrat to complete abstractions in form. And what's interesting to me, again, to return to Bhabha for a second, is that Bhabha actually coins the term in IPTA. And in the 40s, IPTA, Bhabha, and Nehru are very closely allied. But when independence really takes shape and when Nehru actually comes to power, the Congress and the left are no longer allies. The kind of Congress project is to kind of create a liberal humanist vision, as I alluded to earlier, and that means really distancing itself from its earlier commitment to the left. And if there is a sort of Nehruvian Bhabha vision, that is the idea is of basically of a kind of progressivism that is not beholden either to nationalism of a particular kind or to kind of emergent revivalism on the other. And so it's a kind of alienated commitment to form, which has something to do with a kind of vision of modernization. But what I'm going to suggest is not completely explicable as just vision of modernization. And here, the painting that I began with, the M.F. Hussain painting on the fire, the 13-foot mural, is interesting to think about very quickly. This is very much the progressive artist's vision. There's no clear political message. There's no clear commitment to any kind of overt ideology. And Bhabha very consciously chose this against other possibilities. And these are the other possibilities that were offered to Bhabha as candidates for the fire. And in the bottom, you see a painting by an artist Bhabha actually really admired. And that painting captures what one can think of as the modernizing vision that the Nehruvian Science Project is associated with, which is the movement of civilization through particular stages of world history, culminating finally in Western modernity. This could have been what adorned the fire, but what was interesting to me about the vision that the IFR adopted was that they did not commit themselves to modernization as a kind of aesthetic. What they committed themselves to was abstraction. And very quickly, this is where the science of the time becomes really important for me to think about. The thing that I began the paper, the talk with, the idea of Bhabha as the father of the Indian nuclear program, is perhaps the exact opposite of what the 1950s scientific vision that Bhabha was cultivating was. He was extremely anti-weaponization, and he was extremely against any sort of nuclear program. In fact, he led the World Congress against the weaponization of nuclear energy. But more importantly, he, as an artist and a scientist, had committed himself to the idea that science and art was a kind of universalist and universal commitment that did not fall into the modernization myth, that did not say that India had to go through these particular stages of world history in order to be modern. What it said instead was that India was already on par with the world in terms of its aesthetic development, and that it did not have to go through the stage of realism in order to finally get to modernism and abstraction, by saying that modernism was the style for the 1950s and the style that Bhabha cultivated and made possible, was basically saying that India was on historical time coeval with the rest of the world, both aesthetically and in terms of its technological vision. And so for the first decade of TIFR's work, it isn't this vision of India, of science and technology in the form of dams and in the form of big agricultural project that flourishes. What TIFR really is doing at the time is doing work in the most abstract niche of astrophysics, which is cosmic ray experiments. Cosmic ray experiments are basically experiments that are focused solely on particles that come to us from outside our solar system. And all that TIFR did for the first decade of its existence was focus itself on the most abstract of the most abstract branch of astrophysics. And people like M.G.K. Menon, who one might be familiar with later, and Bhabha himself, were very much committed to this idea of science, not to the altar of modernization and development, but science for science sake. And this is where the connection of the art and the science becomes really important for me. If the artist suggested that they were painting art for the sake of pure formalism and aesthetic abstraction, the science at the time was also committed to the idea of science for science sake, not for science in terms of building a nuclear weapon program for India, creating a new development to develop India, but to basically create science in a way that was already committed to a kind of universal equalness between India and the rest of the world. And now I'll end with just this. One way to kind of quickly encapsulate this this conflict and tension is to think of this as a tension between modernization and modernism. So if I began in the beginning saying that the way that we think of Nehru, whether it's from the left or the right, and Nehruvian science, is that it was overtly and overly committed to a vision of modernization. And by modernization, I mean science as taking India from underdevelopment to development in a top-down way through these stages of world history that it must pass. What I find interesting about the work of science and art that's actually happening at the time is that it wasn't at all modernization, but it was modernism. And what I mean by modernism is commitment to abstraction, but also a commitment to liberal humanism in a way that what abstraction really means is not an apolitical commitment to nothing, but a commitment to form as a way of expressing conceptual freedom. So what these artists and the scientists were saying at the time was what is very literally, I don't have time to actually pull out the quotes for that, but what they were saying really literally was that Indian independence didn't mean that we now had to, as a country, commit ourselves to Nehruvian science on the one hand or to right-wing nationalism on the other. What it meant was a freedom to actually choose one's conceptual and aesthetic vision. And if that meant choosing abstraction, science for science sake, art for art's sake, so be it. But that was what freedom truly meant for these artists. And arguably that's what freedom meant for Bhabha as a kind of scientific enterprise. One could argue that this was in its own way a form of alienation. One could argue that it is a kind of turning away from the reality of the time. And it was a turning away from realism as an aesthetic and scientific idiom. But it was not, it wasn't what it is, it wasn't, in the sense of, so yes, so it could be a way, one can continue a critique of the moment of Nehruvian science as a sort of moment of elite alienation, but it would be wrong, in my opinion, to characterize it as flawed because it was committed to this Western model of science that it blindly adhered to, believing with sort of kind of blind faith that committing oneself to Western science would modernize Indian society. I think what's much more faithful as a historical characterization of the time was Bombay as a space that thought that freedom really meant political freedom really meant aesthetic freedom in a way that did not kind of determine the track of what artists should and could do. It shouldn't put them down the path of allying with the nation state project on the one hand, or on the path of incipient right-wing project that was not part of the nation state vision of the time. Science and artists in this vision of modernism that I believe Bhabha to sort of characterize was to stand outside the nation state project and create a different vision of possibility, a vision that possibly died in the 60s and 70s, but a vision I think was, a vision that for a moment became possible in the 1950s. So I'll stop here and I'd be happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Dwight. Lots to think about here. Do you want to take some questions out of the chat? I wasn't looking in the chat, and then people can put questions in the chat or just jump in.
Tim, I can ask a question. This is Pravina Cooper.
Pravina.
I was just wonderful talk and this kind of matching of the art form to the development of the nation. But modernism I mean, do you have any thoughts on the irony of the about the idea that modernism itself, at least in the West, abstract modernism, which this whole group seemed to follow, was itself quite political in its own way, on its own terms, in the sense that it was reacting to the anxiety of modernity. So modernism as the art form at least in Picasso or Cubism or any of those, Braque, for instance, all of them were reacting, or even in James Joyce or in, literature had some of this going, and so did painting. But how do you have any thoughts or comments to the fact that modernism itself was politically grounded in the West?
I absolutely. You basically put better than me the point of what I'm trying to say in this paper, which is that that's how modernism and the modernization relationship in the West is pretty much understood to have played out. That modernization and the kind of technological and scientific changes that it kind of brought about created this alienated artist that was not very comfortable and at home with this kind of new world of new mechanical world, but was actually sort of trying to create a different political vision, whatever that meant in different contexts. What I guess I'm trying to say is that if we take that to be as characteristic of the relationship between science and aesthetics in the West, that's exactly the frame that is really helpful in thinking about science and aesthetics in India. But because it's a post-colony, because it's so it's thought of as so overdetermined by just needs and by lack, modernization is the thing that is the frame that that kind of becomes the major frame through which India at the time is understood, and modernism is pushed outside our vision. So what I'm trying to bring in exactly is this conflict between modernization and modernism. And I'm sort of trying to say that there's a scientific and aesthetic modernism going on in India that is exactly at odds with modernization in India in a way that does not allow us to think of the time as just purely beholden to this kind of vision of modernization. So if you're able to think of the West as caught up in this kind of deep uncertainty and internal cognitive dissonance, that's the same kind of cognitive dissonance playing out in its own post-colonial variant in India. But because we're so used to thinking of India as just as of that moment as if we're so caught up in thinking of that moment as purely this moment that India dived into modernization, with no kind of socio-political vision, we lose sight of what was actually going on, which is this flourishing world of modernist scientific and aesthetic thought, which was not at home with modernization at all.
Yeah, thank you.
Mm-hmm. I had many questions. Again, a fascinating presentation. One question was, how local is this world, right? I mean, you're talking about Bombay. And to what degree is this sort of tension being played out in other spaces and other places across India in this period? And then I guess another question would be, what happens in the 60s? Right? How does this begin to resolve itself? How do, for example, in your larger work about computing, how do, say, commercial forces and uses of computation begin to shape, at least on the scientific side, the vision of what modernism means, right? And what its role is. There are other questions too, but maybe I'll just.
No, that's exactly. I'm so glad you asked those. I think it's really important to keep in mind the locality of this, because it's a certain conjuncture of forces of cosmopolitan, of capital, of cosmopolitan social forces that allow for this to flourish in Bombay. So there's a particularity to the way in which it plays out in Bombay, but interestingly enough, this is exactly paralleled in Calcutta with exactly the same names, with exactly, so the progressive artist group has its kind of, in the same years, parallel progressive artist group that lives and works out of Calcutta, that itself is in tension with both the left and the right at the time. So the CPI sort of in the early days first supports the progressive artists and then breaks away from them, and in the same way as the left in Bombay breaks away from and the two very explicitly break away from each other. And the right-wing forces playing out in Calcutta at the time are condemning the progressive artists of Calcutta at the time. So it's both local. I'd say it's because it's happening in such similar ways in Calcutta and Bombay. I'd say there's a certain kind of urban twist to this story. But yeah, this is not generalizable at all. And that kind of speaks to the second, beyond a certain kind of certain kind of geography, it's not generalizable. And that sort of speaks to the second question. So it's a really, what interests me about this imagination is that it's kind of doomed to fail from the beginning. By placing itself as kind of coeval in historical time with the rest of the world, that it can be modernist at the same time as modernism is playing out elsewhere, is so misaligned with what's happening politically. The Cold War is overdetermining all kinds of processes. So it's a really kind of hubristic vision. It's a naive vision, but I'm sort of interested in how this naive vision is for a decade allowed to flourish. It gets co-opted in certain ways. These artists are successful, but the naivety of this idea that you can be coeval aesthetically and scientifically at the same moment is not something that is allowed geopolitically to flourish. Colonialism continues in other guises after it ends in formal terms. So that raises the question of exactly, this is why this project helps me think about computing, because what happens after this early kind of 15 years of, oh, we can do this as quickly as America can, we can have our first computers work at the same kind of scale and speed as the first American computers can. All this goes to ground when IBM starts basically dominating, flooding the Indian market with their computers, which are basically one version behind the computers that they're developing in the US. But IBM can do this because they have access to a global market, they have access to forms of American power that Indian laboratories can't. So if the Indian, just like the Indian artists who say, naively, we will be conceptually free, the same naivety can be attributed to the kind of imagination of early computing, which is like, yeah, sure, you want to be coeval with the rest of the world, but you cannot compete when IBM comes in and basically floods the market with cheaper, basically cheaper machines. So, and that's exactly what happens. Indian hardware dies in the 70s because what the form of computing that we have now, software and outsourcing, becomes what it is because it becomes clear that Indian hardware cannot match the geopolitical forces aligned against them. So to one more sentence, so it's not the fact that India couldn't have developed a kind of hardware-oriented vision of computing. It was exactly what they imagined for a moment they could do, that they were truly independent to do whatever they wanted. That kind of naivety was soon kind of countered both in art and science by actual geopolitical forces, and computing, in one word, that's IBM.
Dwai, you want to take some of the
Yes,
yeah.
And Kimberly Walter's question. So that's really, yeah, that's a very insightful observation, that is this kind of commitment to, is this what I'm calling a naive commitment to universalism, a sort of elite apolitical, what masquerades as apolitical is actually elitism, is this kind of suggestion that we can be coeval historically and scientifically with the rest of the world, only something that is open to the most privileged elite. And that's why I'm trying to kind of capture the 50s aesthetic scene, because from the point of view of the present, these are elite artists. In the late 40s and 50s, this was honest, this was a really countercultural artistic movement in the sense that art critics, newspapers, institutions, museums, galleries disallowed them from exhibiting anywhere. So the importance of Bhabha is clear, is of note here, because it's because of his kind of use of TIFR funding. He literally just funnels TIFR's budget into buying up all these artists' work that keeps them alive long enough so that they become who they are. Their art was doomed to fail if it wasn't for this completely counterintuitive, untold story of scientific patronage. But again, like you say, the Tatas are part of this, right? How can you call, and you're exactly right, how can you call something that is being funded by Tatas a form of counterculture? Now, this is, I think, is again a really interesting story, because Bhabha again had this kind of flexible ability to move in elite circles, take the money and do something else with it. And what do I mean by that? If anyone's familiar with Bombay, you know the Jahangir Art Gallery is perhaps the best known gallery. Another of Bhabha's outcomes. He basically lobbied the Sir Koasri Jahangir and basically brought into existence the gallery that the modernists would then finally find exhibition space in. But the contradiction is exactly clear there, because he takes Sir Koasri Jahangir's money, but Sir Koasri Jahangir has no idea what Bhabha is doing with it. He thinks it's going towards the nationalist artists that he's fond of. And when he turns up at the opening of his own gallery, he's absolutely distraught to see the abstraction on display. And so in his speech, he says, okay, I'm opening this gallery, but just so everyone here is aware, this is only an example of what Indian art should not do. And this is exactly the kind of art that we need to reject. And Bhabha should have known that, should have known that this would have been controversial. But at the same exhibition, there's Morarji Desai, the Bombay chief minister, everyone else basically coming together to condemn modernism as something that was an anti-national project. And so in the art gallery, the funder of the gallery himself has no clue that he's actually funding modernism. So yeah, there is a kind of taking in of Indian capital, but it's against the ideology of this kind of capitalist elite. The Tatas have no interest in funding this art at all. That's why the Jahangirs, but the Tatas exactly don't fund this art because they suggest that India doesn't have time for art, doesn't have time for modernism. All India needs at this time is modernization. And that's where Tata's funding will go, if to science projects that will bring India into modernity.
I'm wondering if you could say a bit more about the connection you were making in the talk between forms of modernism and abstraction in art to the forms of modernism and abstraction in computational thinking and practice. And are there ways in which, are those connections, how deep are those connections in your own mind and what you've run across in terms of how people are thinking, what kind of work they're doing, and how does it translate from, you know, artistic practice, which is largely individual, to forms of knowledge production, which are much more collective?
That's a great question. So that's, so to put it very quickly, if the Wikipedia entry thinks of TIFR as somehow having contributed to the Indian nuclear weapons program, they could not be further off the mark. What TIFR is really good for in the 50s and 60s is for what I alluded to briefly, cosmic ray research in physics, which is abstract physics at its most abstract, but also perhaps the best mathematics department anywhere in the world. that again, Bhabha puts together by bringing in Indian mathematics from across the diaspora back into TIFR. And what these and there's a kind of direct connection. The head of the department is also, of the math department is also in charge of, is the person alongside Bhabha who collects the art. So there is a kind of, but I don't want to make too literal a connection. What's happening in the math department is again, a commitment to pure formalism. The kind of math being done is the kind of math that absolutely has no application. The kind of physics that is being done has absolutely no application. And so what's going on here? This is not the story we think of when we think of Nehruvian science. We think of science as a sort of applied technology. What is happening in this institute, the heart of the so-called Nehruvian science model, is a commitment to pure abstraction, math and physics. So much so, and this is a very quick anecdote that kind of captures it. I don't know, some people here might be aware of Didi Kosambi. So Didi Kosambi is basically a Marxist historian, or I grew up in Delhi and as a PhD master's student in Delhi, and as thinking of him as perhaps the foremost Marxist historian in India. Turns out that as his day job was actually was the head of the math department at TIFR. And so arguably, one thing I will say in the book is that the person who actually created the first Indian computer was Didi Kosambi. Why I'm bringing this up at all? The story usually goes that Bhabha and Kosambi fell apart because Kosambi was too Marxist and Bhabha was too committed to Nehruvian elitism. What really happened at the time was that Chandrasekhar, the mathematician I'm talking about, and Bhabha got together and got really upset because Kosambi was going around the world saying that he'd proved one of the most abstract hypotheses in theoretical mathematics. And they kept trying to get him to walk it back, and he just refused to, and then they fired him. So what that moment kind of points me to is that Kosambi's failure at TFR, even though he was so central to its foundation for 20 years, and his firing was built on the fact that he was unable to kind of fully work out his conceptual abstraction. He was not able to kind of he hired Chandrasekhar, but Chandrasekhar from Princeton, but Chandrasekhar was the master of abstraction, and Kosambi still had some commitment to application. And what his failure to prove the Riemann hypothesis proved to Bhabha was that he was not conceptually abstract enough, and hence had no place at TIFR. Something like that is just a kind of, some counterintuitive to the usual story I grew up knowing and thinking about Indian science and history at the time.
I think there's some questions in the chat that might be interesting.
That's the Bengal school is such an important group to keep in mind. And that's if people talk of this time, or maybe a little bit before this time, that's the group that dominates the aesthetic imagination. And the Bengal school's basically version of modernism that plays out in Bengal prior to the progressive artists. And what the Bengal school does is a little more familiar, which is that they're trying to suggest that India can have its own modernism, but it has to have some link to Indian tradition. And so people, the Tagores and their disciples basically create a very modern art form. The Bengal school paintings are a vision of that, but they do so with an ideological commitment to thinking of what might be modernism in Bengali, or what might modernism in the kind of epistemological framework of Bengali look like. What distinguishes the Bengal school from the progressive artist group is that the progressive artists say that they exactly do not care about anything that is quote unquote Indian modernism, because what they reject is that break up into dialect. So what they suggest is that as soon as you say Indian modernism, you're immediately going to be thrown into this category of being backwards in historical time from Western modernism. So they say that there is no such thing as Indian modernism, there is only modernism, and we're already part of it. And that's this kind of interesting conflict between the Bengal school and the progressive artists' complete rejection of the Bengal school, because they refuse this idea of an Indian modernism because they think that dooms them to being thrown back into the modernization timeline.
was going to ask, and I don't know if this is irony or connection, but when you look at kind of the historiography, the sort of economic history of Britain, one of the arguments, of course, is that Britain's problem was science was for science sake, and they never could figure out the application piece or weren't interested in the application piece. And a lot of historians have used that as a sort of explanation, right, for the sort of decline of British economic, technological hegemony, whatever. What do you think about that? Irony? Connection?
Connection, really. This is, it's not accidental that Bhabha and the other physicists in it. So a thing that is not kind of immediately thought of again when we think about 1950s India and science is that every important scientist of that time is a particle physicist. So Raman, Saha, Bhabha, and even P.C. Mahalanobis, who in Calcutta basically institutes the two major 5-year plans that are understood to be India's kind of blueprint for development and modernization. Even Mahalanobis is a theoretical particle physicist trained at the Cavendish labs. So all many of them are trained in Britain, but all of them, what they share in common is that they do absolutely the opposite of applied science and technology. They do particle physics in its most kind of abstract forms, and then they're thrown into post-colonial India and given entire institutions to build. I mean, they're good at that, at getting, Saha gets his own institution, Raman gets his own institution, Bhabha gets his own institution, Mahalanobis gets his own massive institution. And so here you have a group of people trained in the most abstract theoretical astrophysics and particle physics in the Cavendish labs, where the kind of British abstraction in science is built, and they're thrown into this post-colonial modernization world where they're like, yeah, take your particle physics, build modern India. The irony is actually exactly right too. That's exactly what happens, and the contradiction is exactly what I'm interested in. The modernization was, there's, I think, in a nutshell, the modernization versus modernism contradiction. You're putting a bunch of particle physicists and telling them to create applied technologies, the one thing that they don't have any idea how to do.
Very interesting.
Yeah, I have this may be kind of a weird question, but my anecdotal understanding of the social life of Bombay in the 50s was that, people of all, this sort of social world was interconnected with not just artists and scientists, but a wide range of other people as well. And there were all these influences sort of flowing through. So how do you situate this particular conversation within a wider flow of a kind of earnest modernism and cosmopolitanism of the 50s that then kind of decays, I mean, what Arjuna Padrai says becomes decosmopolitanized in the 60s and really in the 70s and beyond. So how do you situate this conversation with the wider sort of social stream and varieties of modernist imaginaries that are flowing through places like Bombay at the time?
This is where I think, distinguishing the progressive artists from the progressive writers becomes really important, because Bombay of the time is, there's just so much going on that it's sort of reductive to think of modernism only through the lens of people like Mulk-Raj Anand, which is usually the kind of dominant way of thinking of social modernism in the 1950s, which is this kind of combination of realism and modernism. That doesn't align at all with the progressive artist vision. But what's interesting to me, like you said, the social life of the world is what's really kind of crucial, because there is, even though they are committed to different ideologies, Mulk-Raj Anand is creating the space for the progressive artist to flourish, even though he very self-conscious, very kind of consciously says that artists should be committed to realism. The progressive artists say that we will not commit to realism. Actually, we're going to take out progressive from our artistic collective name because we don't believe in progress. They don't believe the same things, but they work really well together. And so Marg is this flourishing place of epistemological difference. And just because he doesn't agree with the ideology of the progressive artists doesn't mean he doesn't think they are important and interesting and worth cultivating. So there's a kind of multiplicities of modernisms happening in Bombay at the same time. And that's what's really kind of amazing about that moment in the city, that it's not just the fact that Bombay is cosmopolitan, it's that it's cosmopolitan in so many different ways, and that those multiple cosmopolitans can thrive simultaneously. That's what kind of fascinates me about that time. There's no one modernism, there's multiple competing modernisms, and they live well together.
Right.
So I'd like to, I think Dr. Walter's comment, there's a question there too within it. You want to respond to that? I think that's a good sort of concluding.
That's a good, yeah.
So I think not just the book is out yet, but I kind of sense where that book might be going. I think that question gets to that. Do you want to respond to that?
That's exactly where the book is going, yeah. The one way to basically look back to this history is to say that the idea that Indians weren't capable of realism, weren't capable of a certain kind of technological development has just, and that they needed to go through certain stages of world history. That idea in some ways has survived, and perhaps one because if we think about the way in which computing is divided up in the present, the idea is that exactly Indian computing is about doing the back end version of what is computing work, and the real innovation happens in the US, not even Europe. And what this moment kind of points to is, if I talk directly about computing, just a complete refusal of that division. And that refusal very much materialized in suggesting that in hardware, so hardware is where the rubber hits the road, or whatever the metaphor is. If you're saying that we are going to simultaneously innovate and create machines and reject the idea that we have to go through a particular stage of development before we can do so, that's the vision I want to kind of bring back and hold on to, even though I think you're exactly right. What we have is the failure of the vision and the opposite of that vision winning out. But just because it's failed, I don't want to lose it. I want to kind of capture the possibility that was open at the time, that we wouldn't have to do this kind of division of labor, that we could simultaneously be historically coeval. That's the vision in science and art that I think is so worth holding on to.
Very cool. Dwight, thank you very much. Really awesome talk. Really interesting and multifaceted. Do you mind staying on just so you can chat real quick? Okay, thank you everybody. Thanks, Mihir. Thanks. We'll see you next time.